I'm incredibly humbled and very excited to have a discussion with 4 leading and awesome Latinx filmmakers, and I'll introduce them to y'all real quick. Joining us today is Alexandra Codia, an accomplished filmmaker whose latest film, Paper Children, a film about 4 siblings who fled gang violence from Honduras, was recently released worldwide via YouTube original, so please check it out. Her work has earned her multiple honors and awards, including recognition from the National Down Syndrome Congress, the Knight Foundation, and the Women's Fund in Miami. So thank you for being here with us. Here with us also is Shoot Magazine's new director to watch, Lisette Feliciano, a writer and director of the critically acclaimed Women is Losers. Her production company, Look at the Moon Pictures, is one of the first production companies to specifically mandate a 50% BIPOC representation across all leadership positions on and off camera. And it's a sincere pleasure to have you here with us. We also have Cristina Ibarra, a Chicana border crosser award-winning filmmaker, and she got her debut directorial, excuse me, on PBS for her film Dirty Laundry, a homemade telenovela. Recently, her work on The Infiltrators, a collaboration with Alex Rivera, who we also have on here, received the Next Audience and Innovator Award at the 2019 Sundance Film Festival. She's also received awards from Cinema Tropical, rave reviews from the New York Times and USA Today for her other projects, Las Martas and The Last Conquistador, respectively. Very excited to have you here. And last but definitely not least, Alex Rivera, who first broke into the scene with Sleep Dealer, also an award-winning Sundance piece. His work spans from working with the National Day Labor Organization Network, directing music videos for Aloe Black in La Santa Cecilia, and has received praise for The Infiltrators. It's a pleasure to have all of you on here for today. And I'd like to start off this conversation with a very basic and personal question to all of you. Why filmmaking as a medium for activism? Who would like to get us started?
I think that's Christina's answer.
Yeah, Cristina, let's start off with Cristina.
Hi, it's great to be here. So thank you for hosting us with this wonderful group of filmmakers. And yeah, I mean, your question, just get down to the point, right? Why activism? But the truth is as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, I feel like it might be a bit disrespectful to call myself an activist because I'm not really on the ground doing organizing work, which is a whole different, very dedicated skill that is very, very needed. More of what I see myself doing is providing the tools for the activists on the ground, should it resonate with what they're doing. But what I'm really interested in doing through the stories that I'm looking for or trying to illustrate is just to amplify a voice that's unheard. And that's the voice of the border filmmaker, the Chicana. It's a voice that when you do hear it, it's very, it's usually like within a certain dominant narrative. And so my mission as a filmmaker is to deconstruct that dominant narrative of what the border story is. So I guess that might be seen as activism, but it's not exactly, but it's what I do. I don't know if I should, send it to someone else, but do you want to call the next person?
Yeah, let's popcorn it.
Okay. All right. Well, even though Alex is my partner, I think I'm going to go to Ali.
Oh. Hi. It's hilarious, like a hot potato. I kind of second what Cristina saying, which is there are people who, any film, any story that we're telling, there are people who are doing that deep work day to day, and they've done it for decades. And I think a lot of, for example, so the 2 big projects I've worked on, the first one, Monica and David, was about a couple with Down syndrome and their marriage and love story. And then Paper Children, as you were saying, Jesús, is very much, it's a very personal family story, which deals with asylum and touches on so many aspects of what it is, why these children are fleeing and what they're here seeking in our country. But it's funny because whenever I make a film, I always, early on in the process, try to entrench myself in the topic itself, but I do actually spend time with advocates listening to what message it is that they're trying to deliver, and how I try to be very conscious about how to not emphasize the wrong thing. So unintentionally deliver a message that can be harmful to the movement. That's something that I think about a lot. But I also, it's funny, I always like to sit down, listen to advocates, hear where the movement is, and then detach myself for a while and kind of, as Cristina was saying, deliver the film in the sense for them to do their work. But it's interesting. I remember one time we had a brain trust for Paper Children, and a woman from the ACLU had this laundry list of things that she wanted added to the film. And thankfully another advocate stepped in and she said, no, that's exactly what the film shouldn't do. She shouldn't, you don't include the statistics. That's what we do. And we need that help, right? At least I've found that a lot of advocates are very grateful to have the tools, which hopefully is what our films are, and then they take it from there.
Would you like to popcorn it to someone else, Ali?
Sorry. Well, I'm curious to hear from Lissette, just because it's yeah. Sorry, Alex.
Oh my God, Alex, sorry. I want to hear from everybody because, I definitely thank you for inviting me to this. I'm really excited to be here, especially with filmmakers that I respect so highly, like Alex, Cristina, Alexandra. I know I'm relatively like the new kid on the block, but it's just really impactful to be kind of in this space. I would say, I feel like that's the theme, right? We don't want to do a disservice to activists who are actually like sitting there and changing laws and making things like that. I feel like if you look at the history of artists and like where we've been activism adjacent, isn't really like changing emotions or like trying to engage somebody's emotions, so that they will take an action later. So, and that's across all mediums, whether it was like the Impressionists way back when, like Picasso and all them trying to like, get out of the institutionalized type of art and make their own, to where we are now. I feel like the importance of, I think what we're doing is just telling a human story and telling, being like, hey, these people, these are our friends, these are your friends, their names, like and not even so much empathy, because I feel like empathy has like a charity sense to it, but like relatability, right? So like my things are always trying to make these characters relatable. These are you, whether you're African American, Asian American, Caucasian American, Polish, like Indian American, like we're all very similar, and have similar dreams and hopes and things like that. So less of the activism and more of the, and I guess that's a political act in its own way. We were just talking about In the Heights before this stopped, and I don't think anybody would say like that's a political film or anything like that. And certainly not. But the theme of visibility, right? That's a theme that everybody can take on and move forward with, but it's still an entertaining piece that made you feel something, and because you felt something, you're going to say something. So so feel first and entertain first, and then if we get to get a message out with it, fantastic. And I'm going to pass that to Alex now.
Right on. Well, thank you for having me as part of this conversation, and this is a topic that's near and dear to me, and anyways, so it's just great to be in dialogue. Thank you. I think we're wrestling with some definitional questions, like what is an activist versus what is a socially committed or socially conscious filmmaker, what is politics, but for me, I've always operated from like a base sense that every film is, whether you call it political or an exercise of power, that the decisions of who we frame, how we frame them, how we cut them, the stories we tell, the stories we don't tell, and those basic decisions are, we interact with power dynamics, we interact with history. And so I think there's always like you can kind of ignore that, or filmmakers can ignore it and just kind of perpetuate the habits of the system, or you can disrupt those habits. And I've always been interested in being a disruptor in that sense. And, and through my life, I've engaged, like Cristina, like others. I don't really proactively identify as an activist, but I've always been interested in expanding my own universe as a human being. and getting out of the world of people that I know through my family, through my friends. And a lot of times that expansion of my own knowledge, my own experience of life has come through engaging with community-based organizations, activists, whether it was La Asociación Tepeyac in New York, which was a base organization of Mexican immigrants that led to my understanding of the world expanding, that led to a film, or whether it was a National Day Labor Organizing Network here in Los Angeles, working with them that led to the understandings and the relationships that led to the Infiltrators. So I've always tried to think about the world thoughtfully and then find people who are fighting inside it so that they can teach me, so they can stretch out my own knowledge of the world. And that's been part of my process for the past 25 years. But then just recently, we can talk maybe later about how this past project, The Infiltrators, faced a crisis where Cristina and I were taken from the realm of being sort of socially committed filmmakers or trying to basically do symbolic and narrative work into doing material campaign work a fuerzas. We didn't want to, but our film faced a crisis that we got sort of drawn into. And so that's been an interesting experience, sort of going from thinking about images and story to actually trying to get the White House's attention, and so that, but anyway, so that's a little bit on my own journey through these things, and I'll popcorn it back to Jesús.
Yeah, thank you all for that. I saw that I think all of us just had a little bit of a hesitation of assuming the role or the label of an activist. And for me, as part of my work at the Center for Cultural Power, I often see that maybe we're not activists who are on the ground doing the groundwork and organizing local communities for a specific campaign. But I do think that the work that artists do, in order for us to have effective change, to take root in our society and then become codified as part of our society in general, the culture has to shift. And so maybe y'all are not activists in the way that y'all imagine or the way that we imagine a true activist to be, but I definitely see y'all as cultural workers and shifters and disruptors who are working on the cultural wing of these various issues that are incredibly important to members of our communities. So, just wanted to put that out there, that y'all are doing awesome work. The next question is for all of you. And I'd like to preface it by saying that I think today there's a lot of conversations around representation. And I feel that oftentimes it remains on the surface. And it's often about why representation and diversities of stories should exist in a place like Hollywood, and who gets to represent those stories in front of the camera. And I feel like the work that happens behind the camera is typically like a thankless job, right? If you're doing it correctly, almost nobody notices. But if you falter just a little bit, Twitter goes crazy. So the question that I have for y'all is, why is representation crucial and pivotal behind the camera? And I think that we can start with Lisette on this one.
Yeah, I think it's about culture, right? I think you said that I listened to Denzel Washington actually talk about this when he was doing Fences. And he said, it's about culture. Yes, filmmaking is we all know the tools on how to make films. There's shots, you've got to put the bathroom here and the kitchen here and move the camera to tell the story. But, I think he gave the example of Goodfellas, and he was like, that film is a cultural film for Scorsese, right? And it works so well. And not to say that any other filmmaker couldn't have made Goodfellas, but there's just certain things that you pick up from your culture that translate onto the screen, from your own perspectives that translate onto the screen differently. And I do think, to your point about activism, sometimes I think the most political act is just showing up, right? Making it normal for us to be behind the camera, making it normal for the next generation, that they're gonna oh yeah, of course. Like Cristina did that, I can do that. Alexandra did that, I can do that. Alex did that, I can do that. Making that normal, that in and of itself is a political act without, stamping a flag or making anything too ostentatious of the issue. I think just showing up and standing our ground and being ourselves and saying, hey, this is also for us, can be a very can be a very political act as well. And I'm going to pass it to Cristina.
Hey, thanks, Lisette. Yeah, yeah, no, I agree that behind the camera, the representation is just as important as what you're seeing in front of the camera. And I mean, I guess to one of Alex's points earlier, it's just every decision that you're making about your story has to be, it will be felt and will matter when it comes to the way that you're depicting a community. So if you have someone who is not representing the community that you're depicting behind the camera, you're going to be really far away, or your struggle is going to be challenging to get to a point where you're going to really be telling the story from the inside. So I mean, it's incredibly, it's everything, authorship, you know, the authorship of the piece, like that's everything. And I feel like when I first started making films, that if we were trying to make a story about a community that we come from as people of color, that we were judged twice as hard as somebody who was taking a risk and being brave by going into a community that was not theirs to learn and depict. And it was somehow seen as more objective. And so I feel like that is breaking down. And I think that there are these wonderful questions right now that are being asked about, you know, how do we see who are the decision makers are as well behind the camera. So I mean, I think it's pretty much everything, right? It's like that's where the power is, because it's documentary is inherently has a power dynamic that, you know, the author is the one in charge, the one that can do the edit, can frame the narrative. So the person in front of the camera has to trust that person. There has to be trust there, and you know, it's just much better and smoother when you don't have to travel so far to gain that trust. So are we? No, Jesús, you're telling us who's next. So.
Sure. Let's hear from Alexandra next.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think being from the community makes it impossible to not feel, again, speaking from a documentary perspective, which is very specific in terms of the responsibility we have for the people who we're filming. I feel that in addition to what Cristina was describing, which is a lot about kind of the closeness to the community and being fewer steps removed from the story that you're telling, I also think it's so important to always have that very clear sense of responsibility that, yes, there's this power dynamic. And also we need to really think about the well-being of the people whose stories we're telling, because it's not our story, it's their story. And I feel that being from the community, at least for me, it reminds me so much more. Like when I was filming Paper Children, my father arrived as a refugee, unaccompanied child in the 60s from Cuba. I was listening to these children's stories and it felt like I was hearing my father's story. Frankly, these kids were revealing details to me that my own father had never, you know, really shared, because these are really, you know, traumatic memories for someone who's been through this. And trauma was something that we worked through a lot with that project. And in fact, there's a whole other wave of social impact that I'm going to be doing with the film, and a lot of it has to do with trauma. And I feel that whenever you're dealing with very sensitive stories and histories that people have lived through, I think having that closeness helps a lot. I think it just allows for more, not only kinship, but comfort for everyone involved. But the other thing I wanted to bring up too is the audience. I feel that not only thinking about who's behind, not only thinking about what story we're telling and why we're telling that story, but the community that we want to reach. And like with Paper Children, it was a big fight to have the film released completely bilingual, so that every scene in English was subtitled in Spanish and every scene in Spanish was subtitled in English. But I don't know if I wasn't a native Spanish speaker, if my family wasn't, you know, Latino, if that would have been a priority. But yeah, I think the closer we are to the community, the more responsibility and the more we think of it in a holistic way in terms of whose story we're telling, how we're reaching the audience, and what the responsibility is for everybody.
Yeah, and finally, Alex, your thoughts?
Right on. Yeah, I think when we have this conversation about like the politics of who's behind the camera, to me, there's a couple, like, it's a vast conversation. We could do the whole hour on it. But I would just like to identify real quickly a few sort of silos or angles to have this conversation. And I think there are different approaches to it. And one is as a kind of equity, a kind of labor issue, a kind of professionalization issue, which is just, this is an industry, who's getting the jobs. And to me, I'm absolutely like supportive, absolutely militant, like stance that the diversity, the participation in this industry should reflect our cities. So in Los Angeles, where this industry is largely located, that piece of it, should look like LA. There should be, huge numbers of Latinx, Latinish people in the mix. It should be, 50-50 women and men. It's like a simple labor participation issue. But then there's also the sort of poetics of it, which is folks have spoken to in terms of how your family history, how your personal history, how you bring that to bear when you're telling a story of somebody else, especially inside of the unequal power dynamics in our society. If you come from power and privilege and you're sort of parachuting into a different experience, that's a thing. And I think there's a lot of conversation now about how a filmmaker who stands on a certain history that shares something with their subject is going to bring some insight. And I think that's true. However, I have to say, I'm not militant about that. I also believe in solidarity and cross-race solidarity, cross-gender, trans solidarity. I believe that we can, if we are thoughtful, good, open-minded people, like learn from somebody else's experience, commit to fighting with them and for them, and tell those stories that are different. I never walked across a border, but I am committed to listening and understanding and learning and trying to use this art form to tell a story that is not like biologically or experientially my own. And I really do think like making sure to sort of talk about the benefit of having that commonality that we're talking about, but also the power of solidarity and of learning across these kinds of divisions and being able to tell stories and navigate all of that stuff, the professional aspect of this conversation, the equity aspect of it, highlighting makers who have connection to the stories they're telling, and then also believing that we can be a community, that is open-minded and building cross-identity solidarities. I'm interested in telling a story right now that's Asian with an Asian character, and I want to learn, do it in a thoughtful way. I think it is possible and necessary to not just sort of tell stories somehow that only somehow in some imagination belong to us.
I'd like to speak to that too. I think that's a really good point. And something that and one of the things I'm most proud of in Women as Losers is that there is a multicultural experience here. There is, we take a whole scene and dive into the Chinese Exclusion Act and the similarities between what's happening at the border now. Our main character, Selena, is a Latina entrepreneur, American Latina entrepreneur, but she finds solidarity and support in an African American entrepreneur who is, our experiences are different. They're definitely different. But there are similarities and relatability in it. And I even back to In the Heights, John Shug, not a Latinx director in any way, shape, or form, but made that film so powerful and so wonderful. And he talked about his like solidarity with the Latin community and the Asian American community. And he talked about at the screening, he talked about how he felt like he knew everybody on screen because they related to like his grandmother and his family, and these divisions that sometimes I think are dangerous that we could perpetuate within ourselves. Just recognizing that there is space for all of us, and there is space for solidarity, and our work is actually going to be better because of it. I always think about it in finances. The first thing they tell you when you're investing is diversify your portfolio. That's the way it's going to be the strongest. And why is art any different, or anything else that we're doing any different? So I completely agree with that. Like my next project, or one of my next projects, I want to do an immigration story, but it's not at the border, because I think the immigration experience is, the Ellis Island everything that's happening in Syria, everything that's happening on the continent of Africa right now, like that, again, back to relatability, right? Relatability. We are all so very similar, whether you're Latinx or Caucasian or Asian American or African American. And if I'm using the terms wrong, please forgive me. But yeah, I completely agree with that.
No, and if I could add, I mean, I think that your original question, Jesus, why film? It's because we can get past all these silos and past all of this division, and that's exactly it, to have these very human, universal moments where we just relate to one another. And it has nothing to, it doesn't have to be that, excuse me, that literal where I live this exact experience or my family has lived this and therefore, you know, whatever. And I think I couldn't agree more with kind of what Alex has initiated in this conversation, which I think is actually something that's really missing right now in our society in general, which is we are really kind of, we've pushed ourselves back into this place where everyone is in their own little bubble. And, you know, I think there's been so much talk throughout the pandemic about this being a collective experience, but it really hasn't been. And there's still so much growth I feel that we have to do as a, I mean, this is getting maybe a bit far, but I just think our global society is very behind in terms of really seeing one another and understanding one another. And I do think that that's the power of a lot of these stories. And the more universal, it's funny, a lot of times if they're very specific, the stories, they do become more universal in a sense, because it's all of the little details and all of those little human moments where we recognize ourselves. But I do think that that's very important to keep in mind.
Real quick, Cristina and I were having a conversation with one of our advisors on the Infiltrators, somebody who's much smarter than me, is a professor at UCLA named Kelly Lytle Hernandez. And we were talking about the controversy around American Dirt. Do you remember the book that came out that was written by a white author, that the book was like blown up by Oprah and everybody else, a huge deal, a movie deal. And it turned out she'd spent like a week in Mexico and the book was like all confused about, you know, what kinds of tortillas people eat and this, you know, the whole thing was just like kind of a mess. I mean, it was sort of, how do you evaluate when an artist is doing kind of transcendent work, like cross-race, cross-gender solidarity, this type of real deep engagement versus sort of the parachuting. And Kelly said she has the ride or die test. It's like, are you ride or die? Meaning, have you been in it for a long time? Have you like taken time to build relationships in this community? Do people in the community know who you are? Do you know, have you showed up for things that are not just about filming? You know, are you ride or die? Are you in it? Or are you dropping in to grab something quick and get out? And that's going to be shallow. It's going to be exploitative. So it's really about making work that is deep, but also as a socially committed artist, a practice beyond filming, a practice of being engaged in solidarity, you know? And so I think there's a subtle way to go down the kind of middle of this conversation, that you're not like, oh, anyone can tell a universal story, which tends to be a cloak for white power, essentially, like perpetuating male power and white power, because they're the ones who've gotten to tell everybody's story, you know, and going down. So not saying anyone can tell any story, and also not saying only, you know, Asian folks should tell Asian stories, Latinos folks. There's a middle path of like, and then Kelly was calling it the ride or die, you know, and and so that's to me, my personal objective is to be ride or die.
100%. Like that is so key, because you do get parachute people that show up, and like, you know, you gotta always check into yourself, like, am I being a parachute person? You know, that's when I started looking at the moon pictures. I like a few of my sets, the first year I looked around, I was like, this is all males and dudes and everyone's white. Like, what's happening? And it's my own set. So that's when I put in the mandate. I was like, I can't do that. I can't be asking for representation and not do it myself in my tiny little position of power within this company. So that's where that mandate came from, because I had to look around and go, shit, I'm not doing it either. You know, and you know, the branded content that we do, it's you know, we're either working with recidivism, or and it's been years of that stuff. So like, it was beautiful to see like kind of the world kind of stand up for Black Lives Matter finally, right? And we'd been in this work for so long, like trying to be allies for so long. So yeah, 100% walk the talk. And especially I feel like our generation of filmmakers getting very, 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 I won't speak for everybody, but I think I kind of will, are very, trying to get very specific about who are the walk the talk people, and where we align ourselves, like what partners we're aligning ourselves, what stories we're aligning ourselves, what companies we're aligning ourselves with, I think speaks very much to the fact that we are very, very carefully and just quite frankly seeing the parachuters and going, okay, thank you, but we're going to be over here with the ride or dies.
I like that. I like that. Ride or die. I used to call it the hell yes test. It was one of those like, are you truly down? If it's not a hell yes, then maybe you don't know enough about that story to recount it. And maybe it's on somebody else to, or on you to open the door and bring somebody with you, bring up somebody with you to be able to recount that story. For those of you watching, I'd like to recount some stats that inspired that original question. And you can actually find these stats on 50/50 by 2020. And the mission of that particular organization is just to address inequality and diversity in Hollywood. Currently, this is Hollywood, right? 81% of board members in Hollywood are men. 94% of all film executives are white. 78% of media corporation senior leadership positions are male, and 96% of all film directors are men. So the fact that they're within that 4%, I feel like that's starting to widen more and more, and I think that there's definitely a demand for that. And so that's why it's really beautiful to see y'all people here. Having said that, with the growing demand for diversity and storytelling in a place like Hollywood and film in general, the film world, that has not always been the case in the past. And so it's been my observation that whenever there's been a BIPOC filmmaker who actually does get an opportunity and the resources to create a piece, Cristina mentioned this a little earlier, that there is like this experience of being doubly critiqued, right? Or critiqued harsher. And that there's this pressure coming from our communities to get it right. So I'm wondering what y'all think about that. How do you all deal with the responsibility of telling the stories the right way? Would anybody like to start us off?
I think I have to. That's the whole opening scene of my movie, man. I was like, there's no way that I'm gonna get the Gangs of New York budget to like make this 60s period piece in the Mission District. And I felt that responsibility of like, when's the last time we had anything like this, right? And just like that was starting to get to me. And I was like, I'm just gonna be real with everybody and say like, this is a story about making do with what you have, and it's not gonna be perfect. And if you can give me that leeway, I'll still tell you a story and we'll go through that. And I think that's really, like, to your point, it's hard. It's almost like I always say, the only privilege I've ever actually been jealous of from the white male community is the privilege to fail. It's the only, everything else I, have it, but the privilege to fail, because if you can fail, you can learn and you can get better. And a lot of the great directors that we think of as great directors now have had very big failures, but they've been given the opportunity to grow from that, right? To grow from that and try again. And, that the Game of Thrones story, like they shot a whole pilot and it didn't work and they got to reshoot it. I would like to believe that if it was me behind that chair, I would get that same opportunity. And I'm not sure if that's true right now. So yeah, I'd say it is definitely something that we think about. It's hard to have that in your head while you're also creating art, because again, we're not activists, but also like it's a big bird. It's a responsibility, right? It's just something to think about. But I think if, at least what I tried to do was really lean into the entertainment of it and really lean into this is still supposed to be an entertaining piece and you're supposed to enjoy yourself watching it. And yeah, I kind of built in that disclaimer into the movie. Alex?
Yeah, I guess I've never tried to do it right. I've always tried to do it weird and just figured maybe there's people that want to see something that aligns with like their conceptions of their positive selves or something, and that's super good. But I figured there's also other people that just want to be kind of freaked out and see something a little bit you know, forbidden or different. So like doing, you know, Marxist science fiction on the Mexican border, I'll do that stuff. Or with Cristina on Infiltrators, we'll do the thing where it's the undocumented youth that are not presenting themselves as like the good kids, but that are like, we're illegals and we're gonna fuck shit up. And I think there's like pleasure in being an outsider, being an underdog. These are pleasures in American culture that we know from many forms. And I've always liked to play with that red hot material of the outsider, the underdog, the subversive, the countercultural. Sorry, and Alexandra, sorry about that. My tocaya, perdón.
No, don't worry. I didn't know that we were still doing the popcorn, or if Jesus was coming with another question. Which,
either.
By the way, it was really sweet because I when Alex, when you said that you'd like to be weird or something to that effect, I started laughing. But then I have you guys on like a Tetris, and then Cristina's reaction made me laugh even more. It's sweet. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I actually haven't, you know, fought with this too much in terms of my own work. I did a lot of programming before, and that's where I could stand back and objectively watch audiences react and how different the expectation was when it was from their country. So I actually, there's a Cinema Tropical, which I'm sure many of you know, Cinema Tropical. When I first moved back to Miami to work at the Miami Film Festival, I brought Cinema Tropical to Miami, and I would personally, you know, take the print each day, negotiate at the theater, and I really got to know this audience. And it was incredible to me how at first, the audience was very naive. People would come strictly because there was a film from their country, and they sat down and expected that film to represent what they thought of as what it meant to be Peruvian, or what they thought it was to be Chilean. Politically, they wanted the film to align with their own beliefs. And I was a programmer with the Miami Film Festival for a while, and I saw that a lot. And I think so it's different from what you were originally asking, Jesus, in terms of our responsibility in making the films. But I could see why people would really have that dilemma, because it's very real, and the audiences do sit down. Of course, Miami is a unique bubble where you have a lot of people who come, and it was hilarious. I once sat down in the audience for a film. I forget what country it was from, but the woman halfway through, this wasn't Cinema Tropical, it was a film from somewhere else. This woman halfway through sat down, and it was in Little Havana, and she said, "Esto es en chino." You know, she had watched like 15 minutes of the film. She didn't understand anything was happening. She thought it was her poor English, but she finally realized that it was a completely different language. But yeah, we have special, interesting audiences here. But people really, when it was from their country, had a completely different set of expectations in terms of it being a mirror, as opposed to sitting down to watch, you know, artistic storytelling. It becomes very personal for people.
So yeah, I wanted to talk about this question a little bit too. This idea that Lisette brought up about this privilege to fail is very, very real to me. So that resonates with me in so many ways. But this question is really provocative for me, because it's also very personal. Like you mentioned dirty laundry when you were starting as one of my films. I'm so happy you brought it up, because in relation to this question, I didn't know how to make a film. It was how I was learning. So I was just like throwing things together from wherever I could find. I mean, they call it rascuache, right? In like the Chicano art movement. But it's like, I just like was trying to do whatever I could to tell a story that I felt was urgent. But then I started to really want to be deliberate with my storytelling choices and to go to a wider public audience. That film, I didn't intend that, but it reached so many different audiences. Like I remember being in New York and screening it there, and there was a 40-year-old, I'm guessing her age, I don't know, Black woman who comes up to me and says, you know, that 12-year-old Chicana was me. Like that's my life that you depicted. And I was so proud of that. I felt like it was a bridge that I crossed, you know, that was like this film grammar bridge. but then I think that this idea that you have to succeed because you're like, you know, there's so much at stake if you fail, there's so much riding on it. I think it's limiting the voices that we're hearing. Like if you look at public television today, like it's not as diverse storytelling wise, like formally as it used to be. And I think that people who suffer the most are us, like, you know, people of color, because we want to be heard. And so we are our own, we're like, I'm speaking personally here with my own challenge a bit, like, you know, we're struggling to like figure out like, you know, how risky do I want to be, right? Because I want my audience. So it's a very, with every film, I ask myself that question. Is it, am I trying to tell this film the right way, or am I trying to tell the story that I want to tell? You know, it's really difficult. I find that every film is like the same struggle. It hasn't gotten easier. So
to that point, Cristina, like it's really like if you look at history of all like, you know, BIPOC filmmakers, BIPOC artists, I know I'm listening to, like out of nowhere, what you just said to me, I'm listening to Richard Pryor's autobiography, and he talking literally like what you just said with the exact same words in like chapter 8 or whatever. He's talking about like he was trying to do it the right way and it wasn't getting him anywhere, and finally he just did it his way, and he just started talking like he would talk. And now he's, and that's what he's like, that's what pushed him. Freddie Prinze, same thing, that's what pushed him. So like there is, I think that's why I'm like such a history buff, because I feel like if I don't see it now, I can go back in history and look at it and be like, all right, who else did this? Because we're not reinventing the wheel here, you know? There have been other artists that have figured this out and by far it's always like that fear of like, they play it really safe at first, and then they're like, screw it, we're just gonna be ourselves. And that was my journey. You know, this isn't my first attempt at making a film. I failed twice before, never got to the stage where I could like make the film, but scripts after script after script, getting to the point where like, you know, the goalpost was, oh yeah, do this, and then you can do this, do this, and then you can do this, do this, and then you can do this, and hitting the goalpost every single time and having the goalpost moved. I was like, oh, okay, this is not for me. These rules they're not designed for me to succeed. So why am I trying to do it this way? Let me just try to do it. And that's how I ended up with Women as Losers and with that title, quite frankly. Because that's how I felt. I felt like a loser. And you brought up statistics, Jesús, which I love and hate. I love and hate. Statistics are scary. And people have been telling me statistics since I was 16 years old. And they say you're gonna be pregnant by 18, you're gonna be a dropout. You know what I mean? Like it's almost like, which statistics are we gonna look at, right? Like so I try to, yes, the odds are against us, we know that, but we gotta remember that Rita Moreno is one of the very strong, small list of EGOT winners. EGOT winners. There's a lot of white guys that aren't on that list. You know what I mean? And Rita Moreno is. Desi Arnaz, like we watch sitcoms and reruns because he designed it that way. You know, this Cuban immigrant, he was like, oh, my wife's pregnant, she can't film, we're gonna start a rerun. People are like, what's a rerun? You know, like there's a lot of history and success and excellence that we have to draw on, and we can't be telling ourselves that we are, you know, not going to do it, or we're nothing. We got to stop telling ourselves that, because it's not true.
No, I think this freedom to fail thing, I mean, thank you so much for bringing it up, Lissette, because it's almost like we could do never-ending therapy. I feel like on this whole idea, I certainly don't feel like I've ever felt freedom to fail, but I also didn't go to film school. I feel like I'm still catching up. I know that I'm still catching up. I feel that I'm still developing. What?
Eso importa.
No, but it's all, and I think that there are many different pieces, right? There's the whole, who are you responsible to in telling the story? And I think, again, we all feel an enormous amount of responsibility. Sometimes it's very narrow. Sometimes it's really just at the very least for the people. You guys hear a weird echo?
Maybe it's Alex.
There, maybe. So, but I definitely always feel, again, documentary is different from fiction. I feel a huge responsibility to the immediate community. So the actual neighborhood, the families, the church, the school, all these places who let me in. I feel a huge responsibility in terms of what they're going to think of the story. But I also, and this is a different topic, but I think it also changes a lot. At least for me, it changes depending on when the big funding comes in. So I've had one situation where I cobbled together funding and at the very end sold it, which was Monica and David, and then sold it to HBO. And then that was at a different moment in time. We were able to sell the film abroad and to different distributors. But then, you know, on my other film, I had a huge amount of money come in earlier. And that's a very different situation. I think the freedom to fail means very, very different things. But and it's interesting because I think that there's already so much of an internal crisis in terms of these expectations we have of ourselves. Some of it is probably also cultural. I don't know how you all feel, but I was raised to believe in a Cuban household, like I was raised to believe in perfection. And there's a perfection in beauty. There's a perfection in your home. There's a perfection in all these different aspects. You know, my grandparents were not wealthy people, but my grandfather, he was like a watch repairman in downtown Miami, but he wore a full suit in the Miami heat every single day of his life. And that was just part of, now again, it's not true for everyone, but yes, I think there's a lot. But and I think, again, funding is a whole other matter. But once distributors and funders are involved, you gain an incredible amount, but sometimes you lose some of the creative freedom as well. You certainly lose the ability to fail.
Yeah, that's awesome. So we had the privilege to fail, the freedom from perfection, and the liberty to do it weird. I do wish that like we had more patience with our artists, and we gave them the liberty to tell the stories that they actually have rolling around in their brain, so that we can see their vision, so that we can also gain a little bit of perspective as to what their imagination is, as well as their experience. But, you know, at the same time, I try to hold the complexity of it, that it's reasonable that folks also want to see themselves on screen. So I can imagine that it's definitely a very difficult thing to balance. It's like trying to do a very complicated yoga move in front of thousands and thousands of people, you know. I have this question that is similar in tangent. I feel like BIPOC filmmakers, when they actually, when they have a film breakthrough, right? Oftentimes I feel like they have to belabor their own work so that it's more than just like a cultural barrio story, or that it's like a colorful barrio story, right? Or a cultural piece. And so my question to y'all is, do y'all think that this experience of telling our stories via filmmaking will ever become a norm in a place like Hollywood? Why or why not? Would anybody like to take on that first?
I think in terms of seeing what a more just and like inclusive and just rich American cinema might look like, I think Black visionary directors are showing us right now. I mean, I know the numbers are not where they need to be, but I think Black folks, thanks to a history of intellectual production, organizing, base building, political power, all kinds of different ongoing efforts have really laid the ground and are starting to show the world what a rich cinema that actually looks like a piece of America looks like. You know, that you're seeing a diversity of forms talking about the Black experience, and that they are engaging with history. They're not just, it's not like just like the Cosby Show, like it's like a middle-class family, but they're Black. No, they're, you know, you're seeing work engaging with the legacy of slavery, with the Tulsa massacre, with all kinds of like dealing with history, but dealing with it in ways that are wildly imaginative, and exploring the form in drama and comedy and science fiction and horror. You're starting to see it, you know, and so I think it's not a, and they're making, and it's doing business, you know, and so that's like creating real tremors in the industry. I've had 2 Sundance Award-winning films. My first was in 2008. My second was in 2019, obviously with Cristina on the second one. But I had 2 times coming out of the Sundance Film Festival, going through the film industry. And in 2008, I probably met, let's call it like 50 executives. I met one of color, you know. Now that I'm going around the industry again now in 2021, I'm meeting a lot of executives of color. They're there now. The shift has begun. It has begun. So it's not an abstract thing. And I think it really is thanks to the visionary Black filmmakers and everybody inside that ecosystem, you know. So I want to, so anyways, that's it.
The shift has begun. Alexandra?
No, and I think that what Alex was saying is very important, that I think it's, and Lisette was mentioning also how terrifying, you know, statistics can be, and how we have to contextualize statistics and think about which numbers and why we're focusing on those numbers. But I agree that I think that it takes a few incredibly powerful storytellers, which again, going back to this original idea of people who are just incredible at their craft, just really great storytellers that transcend these, you know, silos and these ideas of it being a Latinx filmmaker or a Black filmmaker or whatever it is. But I think we have some phenomenal examples right now. I feel that in the Latino community, we're still catching up a little bit in terms of, you know, I think that when we look at a lot of the representation, at least from my perspective, I think there's incredible cinema from Latin America. But here in the US, there still is, I feel that that's, I don't know how the rest of you feel, but I feel like there is still a bit of a void in terms of more Latinx storytellers that have been able to rise to that level, of course, not including present company, but in terms, looking at it from kind of the bigger picture of, and I feel that, and maybe we need, you know, a little more, and I know Alex and Cristina are involved in some of this community building, and Lisette, I'm sure you are as well. But I do think that we could kind of step up our push a little bit in terms of supporting one another and seeing how we can get more, I don't know, Latinx storytellers up in that top tier. It would be great.
You know, I'm interested in seeing, along with this question, an alternate strategy of like building our own studios and our own like systems, like totally like separate from, in parallel with these ambitions to change the industry. And I don't know how that's gonna happen exactly, but I would love to be a part of that, you know, like to talk about building new funds and new ways of working, you know, outside the industry. I mean, because yeah, I don't know, Alex, I think it has more of a connection with what's happening right now in Hollywood, but I don't know, there's still some suspicion on my end, you know, and I'm like, I'm really interested in kind of traveling both sides, I guess. I don't know if anyone here has ideas around that.
I think that would be, I'm sorry, do you want to go into set? I'm sorry.
No, please, dale.
Well, okay. No, what I was going to say is, I mean, yes to building new systems, but for me also just, I guess to highlight, I guess, something, an undercurrent and something I was saying regarding like the class of like kind of Black visionary makers that are, I think, teaching the world what this kind of cinema should look like, how much history plays in that creative production, how much, you know, whether it's looking at like Ava DuVernay's Queen Sugar, Barry Jenkins' The Underground Railroad, even films like Black Panther that reference histories of colonialism, but it's that this visionary class of Black creatives that is rocking the world right now are working on top of intellectual production about Black history. And that production of knowledge is made in the academy by Black visionary historians who built a knowledge base that then Black filmmakers can work on top of. And in our community, we don't even know what to call ourselves. You know what I mean? There's still a debate about Latinx or Latino or Hispanic. I mean, we're so lost in terms of our own history. And so it's very hard to build like an authentic and urgent Latino cinema because that underlying knowledge of our own history has, I think it's being produced right now, you know. So this is a separate, these are all parallel challenges. We have the funding challenges that Cristina is mentioning, and all these kind of like internal emotional challenges that we've talked about. But there is like this other challenge about like just sort of self-knowledge. Who are we as a people? What is our journey through time and space in this nation? Why are we so disempowered? What do we need to say about that to understand it? You know, and so anyways, one of the things I'm like very interested in doing is trying to facilitate more exchange between basically people who are producing that history right now and storytellers working in the language of cinema.
I just want to make sure that I'm answering the original question. So I just like listened to these amazing answers. And can you just restate the original question as well so that I can?
Whether or not you believe that this mode of storytelling as it relates to our stories and our experiences will ever become a norm in a place like Hollywood, and why not?
Yes, a resounding yes, because our stories are America, because we are, like I grew up listening to NSYNC and Mana, like this is, I am American. You know, I'll tell you the first story. The first time I was ever called an American to my face, I was 21 years old. I'd gone to London where I was studying, and you know, a new British friend had asked me, it's actually my fiance now, asked me, he's like, where are you from? And my whole life I've been saying, I'm Puerto Rican. He goes, oh, where in Puerto Rico were you born? And I was like, oh, I wasn't born in Puerto Rico. He goes, okay, so where are you from? And I said, oh, I'm Ecuadorian. And he goes, oh, great, where in Ecuador were you born? I was like, oh, I wasn't born in Ecuador. And he's like, where were you born? And I said, San Francisco, California. And he goes, so you're American? And I was like, oh, holy shit. Like, it was the first time anybody to my face had called me an American. And the first time I think to myself that I had called myself an American. And that at that moment, everything changed for me, because at that moment, and it was, success was now my birthright. I wasn't on the outside coming in, right? And I feel like that shift is happening now within ourselves, and saying, this is our birthright. We are here. Whether, you know, naturalized or not, or you know, still working towards naturalization, you're on this soil, you're American. And really taking that on was like, okay, so now I can succeed. I can, because everybody else has, and I'm here too, you know? So yeah, I do think it will become normal. I think the more we talk about it, I think the generation before me did a lot of the grunt work, did a lot of the work, thankless work. You know, they almost didn't have the privilege to be as loud about what we're talking about now, you know? So for us to be able to even be here and be like, there's enough to share, there's enough to talk about this now, like we really owe that to the generation right before us that like there wasn't, and they were just trying to hold on. So I'm really grateful. I'm really grateful to them for, you know, my ability to be up here and start talking about how to change stuff. Like, it's insane. That's born on the backs of people like Rita Moreno, like Mr. Olmos, you know, that in and of itself is a privilege. And to Alex's point about like what is the undercurrent, you know, we're all trying to figure out what to call each other and all that. Yes and no, but I think back to that story about feeling like an American for the first time. It's like I think we got to look at how we feel about ourselves first, and elevating how we feel about ourselves inside sometimes, because I mean, we've been called some really not great things by a lot of people, and that stuff gets in. That stuff gets in. As much as you want to feel like, oh no, you know, that stuff gets in. You get called, and the expectation of you was so low for so long, whether you know it or not. Sometimes that does get in. So I just want to say, there's excellence in our communities. There's so much excellence. There's so much beautiful stuff. And we've been doing this for so long, and really like looking at that, forget the 98%, forget all those statistics, look at the beauty that is your birthright also.
Yeah, thank you all for that response, for all those responses. I'd like to take some time to shift over to ask some questions that are coming in from our audience. Firstly, from Katie, I'm sorry. Where would you think that the line is between telling a story that is based on true events and taking creative liberties with the characters around their emotional experiences? Anybody have a response for that?
Well, I mean, Alex, maybe you can help me out here. We can answer this together. I think that might be directed towards us because of our scripted scenes inside of our documentary. You know, I do think it's project specific. It's, you know, you take this this responsibility that you have to tell this story, and you try to make the best choices you can. And sometimes in our particular case, it was a very easy decision in the sense that we knew we had to do something that to represent a place that we weren't allowed in, right? So we had asked permission to go inside of Broward Detention Center, and were consistently denied. We were denied 3 times. And we had these activists, right? And we were looking at the way that their creative vision that they use in their own work. And it inspired us, right? To tell a story using actors, using scripted scenes. And I would say that it's a way of getting at a truth, because it's, in this particular case, we had a tripod of documentary sustaining that script, because we had internal government memos, right, from through a Freedom of Information Act request. We had sit-down interviews, like long sit-down interviews, 2 days long, with our activists and people who were inside the detention center, who were detainees when the infiltration happened. We had research, like, so there was this bed of research and journalism, really, that was sustaining that fiction. So in that particular case, that's what we were wrestling with or grappling with, and we made the choice to go with actors and use scripted scenes. But that was this case, you know, that tomorrow's film is going to be different, and there might be different criteria to decide whether we're going to, you know, whether fiction is the most appropriate way of getting at the truth, or a hybrid, or a straightforward documentary. Alex, I don't know if you want to help me out here, but
so the Infiltrators is a hybrid, and like Cristina saying, documentary scenes and scripted. And when we were going into this land of the putting in reenactments into scripted reenactments into this doc form, I was worried about it. Like, what are we making? Is this still a documentary? What is it? You know, and then I was reading like the New York Times, and I was just looking at like an article in like a newspaper, like, you know, the New York Times is supposed to be like, you know, it's a form of writing that we accept as kind of reporting on truth. And when you read it, there's stuff inside of quotes, you know, that is like from people who are being interviewed, but then there's all this other text in any news article that is written by the journalist. That's kind of language that's summary. So even inside that form, which is just very classically objective, there's always language that is highly subjective, the summarizing language that the journalist does. And then there's the quoting. And so I started to think of our film, The Infiltrators, like that, where there was like one language that we were using, which was scripted, sort of explicitly scripted, that was kind of summarizing the best we could, truth as we could perceive it. And then there was documentary stuff where people were alive in front of our camera, and that material was like maybe like a more faithful representation of reality, but it wasn't, you know, I don't think there's any images that are real and then images that are, you know, and then that there's things that are fake. I think there's things that are kind of more in a spectrum, and we tried to stay inside the sort of truthy part of the spectrum. And I thought that was like a cool place to be. And it's sort of where everything is, you know, sometimes like things masquerade as being simple and true, but like a Ken Burns film, if you watch that, he's not thought of as like an experimental filmmaker, but it's a highly literary form. It's highly scripted, and the voiceovers are just written from a subjective point of view of a historian. And so, so I would kind of unpack that question a little bit in terms of like, what is it, like, what forms do we accept as being true? What forms do we think are fiction? And as an artist, kind of being willing to flow around a little bit with if the intention is clear, you know.
And I think even with a more straightforward verite documentary, like the work that I traditionally do, there's this kind of almost obsession within our industry that it's meant to be very pure and it's somehow therefore objective, and it's not at all. I mean, the fact that we're there with a camera changes things. What we choose in the edit room, when we choose to show up, the relationships that we build. I know, at least for the work that I do, I spend even more time off camera with the people that I'm filming than on camera. And those relationships, you know, change the dynamic of everything, for better or for worse. You know, we do it feeling that, or I do it at least feeling that I'm, you know, that ride or die, I guess is what it is, which we're now all going to be using this ride or die expression, which is great. But it's true. I mean, we're living in, you know, with the people who we're filming, and but every interaction changes the conversation. I know there was one day that I had a really deep conversation with the lead guy in Paper Children, and Fernando, and the next day when we filmed, he broke down on camera, and it was this really, really deep moment. But if we hadn't had that conversation, and I wasn't telling him you need to, but it was more like I was just asking him, how do you really feel? And we weren't even filming right then. And so I just don't think that that any one form, I mean, Alex was talking about, you know, the written form, and journalists make many choices themselves. I mean, what is truth? Actually, this is a whole other, I've been thinking a lot about this lately, this idea that we have this fixation with the idea of truth, and that there's one truth, and that, you know, I think perspective and what you bring changes what truth is, you know, even if you're living the same set of circumstances. So yeah, I think that even within verite documentary, there isn't that perfect objective truth, even if we try.
Yeah, thank you for that. I have,
Oh,
I'm sorry, Lisette, did you?
oh, I mean, you guys all gave great answers. Documentary space is fantastic. And I can only imagine how hard that is on the documentary space. For the narrative space, I would say just use your imagination. You know, use your imagination. It's a story. It's a story at the end of the day. Like, it still needs to follow a structure. You need to have logic and plot and payoff and all the things that make a script and make a feature a feature. But yeah, so use your imagination. I go back to the Impressionists when I think about it, because like up until the Impressionist painters showed up from the scene, it was all still life, and it was all like, we're gonna paint this blade of grass exactly like the blade of grass exists in real life, and that was beauty in that. And these guys just came and was like, yeah, but art, and like changed it up and, you know, blew it out of the water. So feel free to use your imagination, because that's why we're here.
Yeah, thank you for that. We have about 4 minutes left, and I'd like to just pose one question. If y'all could make this as succinct as possible. What advice do you have, coming from Maria Melendez, what advice do you have, excuse me, for filmmakers who want to work more in social impact producing, but aren't entirely sure where to start? Like maybe one little piece of advice or wisdom.
Do you think she means socially motivated projects as opposed to social impact campaign work? I think that's probably what she meant, no?
I believe so. She says in social impact producing, I believe that has something to do with being socially aware of the sort of content that one is producing.
Yeah, it was confusing because there's like I guess a field now of like social impact producer, you know, it's great to hear, Ali, that you didn't go to film school. Alex likes to talk about that a lot too, and in our conversations. And I think, I guess my advice would be to really don't forget your impulse to tell the story, because that's going to guide you, you know, when you're lost. It's your light. So just hold on to that impulse, and you might have to change or make decisions to tell the story in different ways than how you originally started. Be open to that, but just you know, I don't know, it's just like be stubborn like a dog with bone.
Yeah, I'll follow that up. Instinct is a big one. Follow your instincts. Like, it's always right. It's crazy. It's like genetically always right, which is awesome. I think I struggle with that a lot. Like feeling like this was the way to do, but then kind of being talked down a little, talked off of it, and then like ending up in the other place and it not working, and then being mad at myself for didn't follow my instincts. Like if you follow your instincts and it doesn't work out, at least you're not going to be mad at yourself at the end of the day. You got to go home with you at the end of the day. But I would also say just very quickly, like, find people that inspire you and just kind of try and copy what they're doing or follow what they're doing. Again, like try not to reinvent the wheel. Look, like I was trying to say, stand on the shoulders of your giants, specifically people that are like you, that have done things like this already, and learn from them as much as you can. So if there's somebody that you really love in the social impact space that's doing what you are already doing, like really study them, research them, like YouTube, whatever, all great artists leave a breadcrumb of like how they got there. So that's what I would say.
And I guess for me, I'd say like, make new relationships. It depends where you're at in your life and your career, but like, if you're interested in doing socially engaged, like filmmaking, or socially engaged, like impact work, like using films to activate communities, either way, it's like figuring out why do you want to do that? Because obviously socially engaged work could mean so many different things. So what's the piece of the pie that is like interesting to you? Where you're passionate, and then going out in the world and volunteering and just expand your universe. Like I spoke to earlier, because that'll rock you in every way. It'll expand the stories that you can tell. If you're going to tell something that's close to you, it'll enrich that. So I think just expanding your world is a good thing. And then I think, like everyone else has said, just also finding what is you and what brings. Why make art instead of go to law school? There's something about you that is peculiar that's brought you here, and hold on to that, and mix that into the world, so that you create something that is both singular and resonant with the reality that we all share. And so just finding that.
Yeah, and I think prior to some of what you're talking about earlier, of relieving ourselves of that failure to fail, and feeling that we're representing a whole big community, as opposed to our own, artistic exploration. But I think at the end of the day, if we care about an issue, what's going to serve the issue more is a great story, much more so than checking off any boxes that relate to, what the advocates are doing in that space or hoping to achieve. I often do spend a lot of time with advocates that understand an issue well, just to kind of see where the movement is. And I think that is a really vital thing. It sounds like we all in this group do that, but then you need to step away and still just tell a great story that, as you all have said, comes from a very instinctual place. And if this is the end, thank you very much for this opportunity. What a wonderful conversation and such incredible company.
One more thing I'd add to that. Yeah, and remember that you being in the room, you do nothing else. That is a political act in and of itself. Your abuela or your abuelo, that's what they wanted. They wanted you in the room. You're already a political act. You're already changing everything by being in the room. You do nothing else after that. You're there. You're already there. So give yourself a little bit of a break.
Yeah. So thank you all. We are at time. So this has been a very thought-provoking conversation with a lot of insight and a lot of experience. And I'd like to thank all of our panelists for being a part of this conversation, as well as the crest that is creating tremors within this particular industry, shifting culture in the way that you approach your work. Thank everybody for joining us, and for all filmmakers who are watching, as well as people who find themselves in the audience. Let's remember to strive for allowing our artists the privilege to fail, like we've said multiple times, and the liberty to make art and do it weird. So yeah, thanks to Lalif. Thank you all for tuning in, and yeah, peace.
Thanks, bye.